Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is November 13th, 2024. Wednesday, November 13th, 2024. And let's start off with some good old fashioned true crime. This is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled Monsters of Ecatepec. In 2018, a couple is arrested transporting plastic wrapped body parts in a baby carriage. Further investigation found they were responsible for at least 20 other murders of mostly single women. Single mothers. According to Mexico's state prosecutor Alejandro Gomez, during interrogation, the man admitted to raping and sexually torturing the victims before killing them. He also said that he sold some of the body parts. The man said that he had also ground the bones to be used as fertilizer and the flesh chopped up to be used as pet food. He also implicated his wife as committing the murders as well, even though it's believed she was used to lure the victims with a promise of baby clothes into situations where they could be kidnapped and killed. During a news interview, Gomez described when the man spoke of the incidents in a totally natural way. He said, quote, "I would say he actually seemed happy to have done this. He wants people to see his picture, to know his name. I would obviously classify this person as a murderer, a serial killer. He has a mental disturbance consistent with psychosis and a personality disorder. While she has been mentally disabled since birth and also has acquired induced delirium, both can distinguish between right and wrong." End quote. The killers, named Juan Carlos Hernandez Bejal and his wife Patricia Martinez Bernal, had met in 2008. They were both born in Lázaro Cárdenas, Michoacán. A psychiatric examination was completed before they appeared in court. Hernandez was born to a single mother, who he said often dressed him as a girl and forced him to watch her have sexual encounters with different men. He was also sexually abused by a female caretaker. When he was 10 years old, he fell from the stairs and suffered some type of brain injury. Hernandez said that he hated women because of his mother, but also claimed that he was a demon and that he needed to drink human blood at least every 3 months. Martinez was poor but manipulative despite being diagnosed with a borderline intelligence disorder linked to intellectual disability. She said she was physically and sexually abused since the age of 6. There was a time she was prostituting herself since she was living on the streets. When they met, she worked as a prostitute at a bar he would frequent. Despite Hernandez bragging to her he was an assassin, she moved in with him. During their 10-year relationship, they had 4 children and opened a small business where they sold perfume, cell phones, and clothing. Martinez confessed they started the murders in 2012, and their first victim was a 22-year-old woman who her husband lured with a promise of a job. He took her to the bathroom where he raped her, then beheaded and dismembered her. Martinez kept their children outside the house located in Jardines de Morelos while he committed the murder. Afterward, Martinez cooked the body and ate it with her husband. Their second victim was a teenage neighbor who was addicted to inhalants. Her name was Luz del Carmen Miranda, 13, who disappeared on April 12, 2012. Like the other victim, they lured her with a promise of money. She was raped, beheaded, and dismembered. Her flesh was cooked by Patricia with oil and salt. Like other cold-hearted killers, Hernandez helped the girl's father in trying to locate her, knowing full well that he had murdered her. The remaining body parts were fed to their dogs. Hernandez said he sold the bones to a man which he refused to name. The man was a santero. The couple also dabbled in dark practices since they promised their last 4 victims' hearts as offering to Santa Muerte. One of their dogs had eaten one of the promised hearts, which they attributed to the reason they were caught. The couple who bought the child were arrested and the baby was recovered. They had paid 15,000 pesos for her. She was returned to her maternal grandmother. Most disturbing of all is that the couple were living with their own children, with their own 3 children, one of which was a baby during the time that they were committing the murders. The couple were discovered after they were put under surveillance in an effort to locate 3 missing women, Arlette Samantha Holguin, Evelyn Rojas Matus, and Nancy Noemi Huitron, all who had the number of Patricia Martinez Bernal on their phone records. Also missing was a 2-month-old daughter of one of the women. When police saw the couple pushing a baby stroller, they were arrested, only to find there was no baby in the stroller, but a human torso wrapped in a black plastic bag. Police searched two houses the couple used, and they found 8 cement-filled buckets with human remains buried in them. In a refrigerator, more body parts were found wrapped in plastic. Later, it would be determined that the remains belonged to 8 different women, though DNA tests would identify only 4 of them. Clothing found scattered about was suspected to belong to the victims. Other body parts were found in the vacant lot where the couple was arrested. Apparently, this was a dumping ground they used on previous occasions to dispose of the women. The remains were in such bad condition that identification could only be made forensically. The youngest victim was the daughter of Guadalupe Castillo. The girl was 7 years old when they took her and her mother. Hernandez said his original plan was only to kill Castillo and kept the girl hidden for a week before he suffocated her to death. Interview of neighbors indicated the couple moved to the neighborhood only a year before. Ecatepec has a history of violence against women and girls, and hundreds of residents in the area have protested to the police. Candles and white flowers were brought to the area where the crimes were committed. Mexico State, where Ecatepec is located, recorded the number of 301 women and girls, possibly more if one includes those that have not been discovered. In 2017, 28,702 murders were recorded, a surge since 2006, when the government started using the military to combat the drug cartels. It has the most femicides in the entire country. The couple stood trial separately for the murder of 8 women between April and October 2019. They were also charged with hiding human remains for the purpose of concealing a crime and human trafficking, as when they sold the baby. They were sentenced to 327 years each. Even when authorities think they've landed the largest shark, such as the butchers of Ecatepec, there's always a larger predator hunting the waters. Such is this case of Andres Filomeno Mendoza Celis, 74, who was arrested in May 2021 in his home in the Mexican municipality of Itzapan de Zaragoza. Like the Ecatepec investigation, what turns out to be a search for one woman unraveled to expose a multitude of victims. Reina González Amador, a mother of 2, had disappeared. Her husband Bruno Ángel Portillo, who was serving as a police officer, forced his way into Mendoza's home, located on Margarita Street in the Lomas de San Miguel neighborhood. He found her mutilated body on a table. The woman had gone to Mendoza's house, who unbelievably was a family friend, to buy a part for her cell phone. It's rumored that Mendoza drew inspiration from the film The Silence of the Lambs, which is the year he committed his first murder, but this has not been verified. It was noted that Mendoza, like other serial killers, presented a harmless facade to those around him. He was a former president of the Lomas de San Miguel Neighborhood Advisory Council. Most of his life he had been employed as a butcher in a slaughterhouse. I'm going to know I can't pronounce this right. Talenpantla. I can't say that. Which may account for his expertise in preserving the skinned faces of the victims he kept. During the questioning, Mendoza confessed to killing about 30 women in a 20-year span. He kept a roster of their names in a notebook found at the premises. He not only killed them, he also cannibalized parts of their bodies. In true serial killer style, he recorded the mutilation and murders of the crime. He peeled off the women's faces and scalps. Cadaver dogs were brought in to find human body parts. The flooring of his house was drilled into where human remains and hair of several women were found. The killer also kept the victims' clothing and shoes. The skeletal remains of up to 5 victims were found, as well as knives believed to have been used to kill and dismember the women. Initially, it was reported Mendoza could not bear the rejection of young and pretty women. A neighbor of the killer said, quote, "He always bothered women. His gaze traveled over their bodies and fixed on their buttocks, legs, and breasts. They always said he looked perverted. When they found him drunk on the street, they preferred to turn around. He drank too much and made them uncomfortable by comments he made to 30 and 40-year-old women." End quote. As the investigation progressed, it was found the 74-year-old had murdered at least 30 women, and more than 4,000 skeletal remains belonging to his victims were found in his home. The majority were women, but eventually the bones belonging to a man and child were also identified. A fire chief who responded to the crime scene found perfect cuts of meat ready for consumption, as well as kitchen tools, anatomy books, murder films, bloodstained knives, cooked meat, and hanging pieces of skin. In the diary he kept of his victims were noted the date they were taken, as well as the weight of each body part from that woman. There was a list of about 30 to 40 women. This is the type of information kept by a butcher's office to determine how much will be paid for each section of meat. For example, he noted on a sheet where the breast weighed approximately 4 pounds and a leg weighed 8 pounds. In the basement, reached via an overlapping wooden staircase, there was a table full of blood and various knives, an apron, a Hannibal Lecter-style muzzle, and a recording camera. The worst was the horrible stench in the place. Authorities discovered a room under his bedroom where he buried his corpses. The floor had to be removed to get the remains of the victims. It turned out that this monster used his crime to commend himself to his neighbors by distributing meat to them. He even invited several police officers from the area to a meal mostly made of carnitas. He also sold the human remains as enchilada meat, which he said was wild boar meat. Mendoza was originally from Huaca. Once per year he would visit his hometown located in San Sebastián Rio Dulce, municipality of Cimatlan. He would bring meat in coolers that he said was pig. He would distribute the meat to the neighbors. He also gave away clothing which now many believe belonged to his victims. In March 2022, the murderer was sentenced to life imprisonment on the charges of just one of the murders. He was also fined to pay reparations, but in truth, due to his age, the victim's family will never see a nickel of this money. Mendoza would go on to receive a sentence of 55 years, 92 years, and in February 2024, he was sentenced for the 8th time for the murder of a woman who disappeared in April 2012 in Colcalco. Her remains were identified in Mendoza's home. The elderly man, who was originally known as by the moniker of El Chino, has now been renamed to the Cannibal of Itzapan. One has to wonder if any of his neighbors suspected he was killing and eating women for about 30 years. Mendoza would on occasion rent out rooms in his house. A man who had once stayed there was interviewed during the production of a documentary titled Caníbal Indignación Total, and he confirmed that the killer would share his victim's flesh with the neighbors as well as sell it. Since Mendoza had always worked as a butcher, this lent him some credibility. When he was in his neighborhood, he would say the meat was from a boar taken in Huaca. When visiting Oaxaca, he would claim the pig was from the Mexico state. A psychologist who was interviewed during the documentary said that noted that Mendoza saw the women as animals instead of human beings. I'm telling you, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I just don't know what to say about that. And I guess my other thing is, you would think that the smell that coming out of these places would be bad. Because even though the first one were the couple, I mean that, I don't know, maybe I'm even if let's say they disposed of these victims and they dumped them, you would think, man, the smell would have been so bad that wouldn't somebody say there's a dead person out there and these two with a stroller with a torso, and then this other guy who's burying these 20 years of murders, and you would think, man, the smell that must have been coming out of that place would have been horrendous. I don't know. There's something there. I'm missing that. Anyway, back to Stranger Than Fiction stories. And, I don't know, something about the basement. This is titled Under the Basement Floor. Over 100 years ago, a frail nun who lived in a remote Michigan village was murdered and buried in a shallow grave in the very basement of the holy grounds where she lived and worshipped. What was uncovered during the subsequent trial spoke of lies, sexual trysts by those holding holy office, and the attempt to spare the Catholic Church embarrassment, even if it meant covering up a murder. Holy Rosary Catholic Church in Isadore, Michigan was dedicated August of 1883. Next to it stood Holy Rosary School, a 3-story brick building that along with the church served generations of the Polish immigrant families of Leelanau County. Sister Janina was last seen on August 23, 1907, the same date Father Benowski left with his sister Susan and grew by the chore boy for a fishing trip. When her 2 fellow nuns awoke from a nap that same day, they could not locate Sister Janina. What they did find was the schoolhouse's back door partially open. This was strange since it was always kept locked. Sister Janina's open prayer book was on the windowsill. Almost 24 years to the date of its dedication, Father Andrew Banowski, the pastor, returned from the trip to Carp Lake, now Lake Lilanau. It was not long before it was brought to his attention that Sister Mary Janina, Sister Superior of the convent, had disappeared. When asked by Father Banowski, Stella Lisenska, the housekeeper, and her daughter Mary also denied seeing the nun. The father took over a week to notify the authorities. However, foul play was not suspected. In fact, it was believed Sister Mary had forsaken her vows and run away. Traverse City police duly searched the area but with no success. Wyandottes police were told to look for her, which is where she had lived up to the age of 9 in case she returned to the area. The church family at Isidore was small when Sister Mary Janina arrived. It included Father Andrew Banowski, his teenage sister Susan, and a chore boy named Gruba. In the 1900 census, Frances Panic, a 26-year-old single woman, kept house for Father Banowski. However, by 1906, Stanislawa, or Stella Lipsenska, was installed as a housekeeper with her daughter Mary. She had left Poland around 1900 with Mary after her husband died. It's not clear when Stella joined the household, but more than likely she took over in 1905 when Father Andrew's mother Julia, who had lived with him, died. The sisters lived in small quarters on the schoolhouse's second floor. The other members of the household slept at the rectory, except Gruba, who went home. Father Andrew had his own oddities. He kept a badger, parrots, a fox, and an alligator, which was free to roam where it wanted during the summer months. During the cold winter months, it slept in the rectory. Somebody apparently disliked the alligator enough to brave Father Andrew's displeasure because it was poisoned. The 3 teaching nuns, Mary Janina, Angelina, and Josephine, were all tubercular, which is why they had been sent to the small Michigan village, hoping the clean fresh air would help alleviate their symptoms. Dr. Freilich from nearby Maple City was summoned to attend them. The 3 sisters taught about 200 children at the Holy Rosary School, and during the winter most of them boarded with the nuns. The summer of 1907, instead of returning to the Felician Convent in Detroit, as they originally planned, they decided to stay in Isidore. All the students were at their homes. A week after Sister Janina disappeared, 2 things happened. Over 250 men from the Isidore Catholic Church volunteered to search for the missing nun, and the other 2 remaining sisters left the convent, claiming they did not want to meet the unknown, but feared fate of Sister Mary Janina. Even when Father Banowski pleaded with them not to leave, they left anyway. Obviously, they did not believe that Sister Mary had forsaken her vows and run off. The volunteers split up into 3 groups, and a bloodhound was brought in to help in the search. In a nearby swamp, pieces of clothing were found, as well as where someone had eaten some berries, but eventually they were no closer to finding the missing nun. The searchers still didn't believe anything bad had happened to her, only that she was wily enough to have escaped from the search group. In the midst of the search for the missing nun, a clairvoyant from Kingsley said Sister Janina was being held captive at a house on Glen Lake. The sheriff searched the place based on her description and turned up nothing. Unaccompanied young women were suspected of being the runaway nun, and in October 1907, a woman named Frances Cox, who was from Boston, was held by Frankfort police on suspicion of being Sister Mary Janina. They didn't release her until Father Banowski came forward and verified that she was not Sister Mary. The years moved on, and the mystery of Sister Mary's disappearance faded, and many thought she was living under a false name in some other place, possibly having married and had children. There was no pity for a woman who was thought to have forsaken her vows to Christ, but that was to change 11 years after her disappearance. The events of what happened to Sister Mary on a hot August day over a decade before was only exposed for 2 reasons. 1, the church wanted to keep her fate and whereabouts a secret, even if her reputation suffered for it, as well as protecting a murderer. And secondly, that one of the persons charged with protecting these secrets did not know how to keep his mouth shut. In 1913, Father Andrew Banowski was replaced by Father Leo, after he was transferred to a church in Manistee. Stella Blasenska had moved to Milwaukee with her daughter, who had married. A few years later, she returned to serve Father Banowski as a housekeeper once again in Manistee. During those intervening years between Sister Janina's disappearance and the murder investigation, Sister Angelina and Josephine died of tuberculosis, and Gruba moved to Canada and disappeared. In 1917, Father Edward Podlaskui, Podlaski was assigned to Holy Rosary Catholic Church. In 1918, as pastor of the church, he was making plans to tear down the old church and construct a new one on the site, which set a catalyst in motion. It appeared the whereabouts of Sister Mary was a mystery to the general population, but not to several fellow priests of the area, one of them being Father Leo, who discreetly told Father Podlowski that Sister Mary was to be found only a few feet from where she had worshipped, and that the planned construction would bring scandal to the small church. They told him she was buried in the basement of the church, and that's exactly where Father Podlowski found her remains in a shallow grave. Podlowski later testified that he had been instructed to disinter the body and rebury it with the utmost discretion, and he asked the local sexton, Jacob Fliss, erroneously reported as Jacob Fleece, to help dig her up and bury her in the church cemetery. It was not long before the secret of Sister Mary's disappearance came to the attention of Leelanau County Sheriff John Kinukan, and by February 1919, arrest warrants have been issued for Father Banowski and the woman who had been his housekeeper during his tenure at Holy Rosary. Banowski did some fast talking and was not arrested. However, a guard was placed around the parish house he was staying at. Stella Lipenska was promptly taken to jail. Some newspaper accounts hinted that the secret witness was the sexton, and another story claimed that there were two other witnesses, Reverend Father Joseph A. Lemke and Sister Antonia, Sister Superior of the Felician Convent in Detroit. Father Lemke testified that he was informed in 1915 by Bishop Edward Kozlowski from Milwaukee, who died shortly afterward, that the nun had been killed and buried under the church. He was one of the priests who had informed Podlowski of what would be found during the construction of the new church. Sister Mary Antonia corroborated Father Lemke's testimony, stating that Mother Mary Veronica, Mother Provincial of Milwaukee, quoted Bishop Kozlowski as saying Sister Mary John did not forsake her vow at Isidore, but was killed by a woman and buried under Holy Rosary Church there. Father Edward Kozlowski had only been made a bishop the year before 1914, but he, like many other priests, might not have killed Sister Janina, but were complicit in keeping the secret of her murder. The whereabouts of Sister Mary would have remained undiscovered had it not been for an indiscretion by Father Pulaski. In those months prior to the secret exhumation of Sister Janina's remains, he was carrying on an affair with his 19-year-old housekeeper, Martha Miller, whose father was a farmer in the area. In December 1918, the priest drove the unmarried Martha Miller to Ann Arbor Hospital to give birth to her illegitimate child. She later testified that during the trip he told her the secret of what happened to Sister Mary and what he had found under the dirt of the basement. He implicated the sexton, saying the man had helped him in this bit of skullduggery. This information was wrested from Martha by her father after her return to Isidore, who then notified authorities. Another confession that Martha made was that she had been having an amorous relationship with Father Pulaski. What do you think are the odds that he was the father of her child? Eventually, Father Pulaski made an appearance before the church tribunal, where he was stripped of his position, titles, robes, and duties. He was shuffled through the years from parish to parish, and eventually disappeared from all records. More than likely, this everlasting punishment was inflicted on him for having loose lips rather than for betraying his vow of chastity. Police started their investigation, which included locating Jacob Fliss, who later signed an affidavit that he had indeed helped Pulaski with what was left of the poor nun in a shallow grave, which was a few bones, a rosary, a steel ring, and part of a cord used on the nun's frock. He said that after they had buried her, they had covered the secret grave with shrubbery. Officers dug up the hidden grave in the cemetery and found what Jacob had described inside a small wooden box. They took the remains into evidence to be used later during the trial. Initially, it was not clear why Mrs. Lipzanska had attacked Sister Mary. It was said that she had several altercations with her before the day of her disappearance, and she was also said to be jealous of the nun. The jealousy supposedly stemmed from an illicit affair Father Banowski had not only with Sister Mary Janina, but all three of the nuns at the convent. During the housekeeper's subsequent trial, numerous Isidore residents testified how she had referred to the Felician sisters as priest wives and whores. What many failed to recognize was that Sister Janina and the housekeeper were contemporaries in age, the former being 37 and the latter 38. During the initial investigation, the police used the ring found in the wooden box to establish if this was indeed the bones of Sister Mary, and if the dates engraved inside it matched up to the dates of the sister taking holy orders. The bones were laid out on a table in the courtroom, and the cause of death was ruled to be a skull fracture. Sister Mary's story was tragic indeed. She had been born Josephine Mazik in 1870, and she had immigrated with her parents and siblings from Czechoslovakia, and they settled in Chicago. In the 1880 census, she was counted as part of the household, age 10, but was away attending school. The rest of the members were her father, John, 53, her mother, Josephine, 48, her brother, Joseph, 18, her brother, Frank, 13, and her younger brother, Emmanuel, age 8. In January 1883, John Mazik, misidentified by the newspapers as John Mazik, was shot and killed by Peter Sorgel, a police officer, over a dispute at a dance held by the St. Francis Bohemian Catholic Society. Mazik was listed as the janitor at the church. 4 months later, in April 1883, Josephine Mazik was declared insane by the probate court as a result of her husband's death, and she was committed to the Illinois Eastern State Hospital for the Insane. Sister Janina was not turned over to the orphanage as sometimes reported, since she was already boarding at the school with a Felician sister when this happened to her parents. Also, her brother Joseph was already an adult and worked as a carpenter. Officer Peter Sogo was visited by justice in 1888 when he was shot several times by a cowboy named Everett, which caused him to quit the force. Then in 1897, when he was sitting in front of the 1st Regiment Armory, he was dragged behind the railway tracks, where he was choked and beaten by 2 men who tried to rob him. He was rescued by the arrival of an officer. He died in 1903 as an inmate of the insane asylum. He was 35 years old. On August 12, 1890, when she was 18 years old, Josephine received holy habit, and her name was changed to Mary Jana or Johns. She took her first vows in August 1892, and the second in August 1901. In 1906, she was sent to Isidore, and she disappeared August 1907, when she was 37 years old. When the police sought warrants for the murder of Sister Mary in February 1919, both Father Banowski and Mrs. Lepenska denied any knowledge of the secret grave or the burial, or the murder. Within a day of her arrest, Mrs. Lepenska posted the $4,500 bail imposed by the judge. This money was obtained with help from Father Banowski. Rumors circulated that the police believed Mrs. Lepenska was really the accessory of the crime and not Father Banowski, and they were hoping they could squeeze a 50-year-old woman into providing information as to who was the true murderer. Father Banowski insisted that he had gone on a fishing trip with his sister Susan and the sexton Jacob on the day Sister Mary had gone missing. He told authorities that he had even offered a $500 reward for information, and had notified Sister Mary's brother Frank Mazik in Chicago, who said he would come but never did. But as the days passed, the plot thickened when it turned out that Mrs. Lepenska's daughter Mary, who had lived with her during the time of the nun's disappearance, was now Mrs. Joseph Fliss, and a cousin of Jacob Fliss, the sexton who was implicated with assisting Father Pulowski. Justice moved quickly in those days, and by March 1919, Stella Blazanska was set to stand trial for first-degree murder. One of the first to give testimony was Jacob Fliss, the sexton, who said that Father Pulowski had told him it had been Mrs. Lepenska who had killed the nun, but did not offer how he knew this information. The proceedings came to a grinding halt when Mrs. Lepenska started acting like she was insane, so it was determined she needed to be assessed. This slowed down the proceedings. However, by the end of October, she had been found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life with hard labor to be served at the Detroit House of Correction. A rumor and a suspicion that circulated amongst those involved, but never introduced into the proceedings, was that Sister Mary had been pregnant. Mrs. Lepenska's conviction in part was based on testimony of an undercover woman detective named Mary Talika, who had been placed in the jail cell as another inmate, and later testified that Mrs. Lepenska had confessed that she had killed Sister Mary with a spade, which she used to hit her over the head. The detailed confession is as follows, quote, she, as in Stella Lepenska, wanted me to go to Father Banowski and tell him to have Father Pileski put out of the state and that Father Banowski would pay me well for my trouble. She said she feared him as he knew all. She said, I went to confession, confessed my sins to Father Nowak at Milwaukee, but he would not give me absolution at once. He said he must first see Bishop Kozlowski. He went away and told me to wait in church. In a few minutes he returned and gave me penance. I have done my penance. My sins are forgiven. Why do they bother me? I guess I might as well tell you. Yes, I killed Sister Janina. I first stunned her and then went out into the garden and got a spade. I dug a hole under the church, dragged the body to the hole, and put her in it. As I was trying to cover the head, it would always rise up. Then I took the back of the spade and knocked the sister 3 times in the head with all my might, as I have told you, just as I told Father Nowak in Milwaukee. Pretty soon I won't be here. I'll be in an insane asylum or a hospital. I'm going to pretend I'm crazy, and they must believe me. The doctors can't tell the difference because they can't look inside of me. End quote. Within a year after the conviction, Mrs. Lepenska's attorney had taken their appeal of the sentence to the Supreme Court, claiming that said confession was obtained under duress, and that the skeletal remains had never been positively identified as belonging to Sister Mary. The courts denied her appeal. However, in January 1927, she was paroled by Governor Groesbeck, and by 1931 she was considered fully rehabilitated and taken off parole. She joined her family in those intervening years and never made any public statements concerning the murder or the court proceedings. She went on to be hired as a housekeeper by the Felician Order of Nuns in Milwaukee and died at the age of 92 in 1961. If she was the murderer or the conspirator, it was a secret she took to her grave. One thing was certain: though deeply devoted to the Catholic religion, even before the murder allegation, she had a reputation of being stern and unlikable, a view shared by residents of Isidore, her few friends, and family members. Father Andrew Banowski died in 1964 at the age of 89. Even after her death, mystery surrounded Sister Mary Janina. During the trial, fellow nuns were allowed to perform a brief ceremony over her bones, since she had never received funeral rites. This was the last time it was known what became of her remains. Some say that she was buried in an anonymous grave in the Felician Mother House in Detroit. Others that her anonymity continues, but in a grave in a cemetery down the road from Holy Rosary Church, possibly at the foot of a large cross spared from a lightning that hit it in 1989 that destroyed other trees and monuments around it. In truth, the unsolved mystery regarding the murder of Sister Mary Janina may not be who did it, but why. Was it jealousy, a secret pregnancy, or something else? 100 years after the murder of Sister Janina was exposed, the village of Isidore has become a practical ghost town. The movie The Runner Stumbles from 1979 is based on the incident of Sister Janina's murder. Writing the play began in 1965 and debuted in 1971, finally appeared on Broadway in 1976. And you think about, because I was like, well, and it almost, I mean, let's say Stella, the housekeeper, did hit her with a spade, which, by the way, based on this, she might have even buried her alive. Did she really do it because she was jealous? Or was she told to do it by Father Banowski? Or, how's this? When you tell somebody to do something, but indirectly? And because I'm thinking, well, here's Father Banowski. He has a housekeeper who's a widow with a girl, with a daughter. You know, she does her work, whatever. She's unlikable because they even said nobody liked her. But, and then it turns out, let's say he does come back from his fishing trip and he finds, where is Father? Finally, he finds out that his housekeeper murdered one of his teaching nuns. And I think to myself, why wouldn't he right then and there say, you know what? We gotta go to the police. You've murdered someone, right? And let's face it, the only reason he wouldn't have done that is that there was truth into what Stella, the housekeeper, was saying, that he was having either sex, having some type of intimate relationship with Sister Janina and all three of them, all three nuns, and possibly, which is why he, you know, and also the possibility that she was pregnant. I'm thinking was, but let's face it, here he's having these relationship with these three nuns, but who's to say different one way or another? That is, unless one of them gets pregnant. Then what do you do, right? So maybe he, I don't know. You always think, did this housekeeper take it upon herself to do the dirty work, or was she kind of motivated somehow or other by this priest? Because even after everything, after they leave, and he knows full well that she's the one that murdered the sister, she goes and becomes his housekeeper at another parish. And then also the fact that all these other priests, even up to the level of the bishop, are all willing to let everybody think that Sister Mary ran off and shucked her vows, and I don't know. Too much protection of the crazy Stella housekeeper, and all of them keeping their mouths shut. And then, of course, the other two sisters, they die of tuberculosis. A group of the chore boys said, I'm out of here, I'm going to Canada. And that's it. And yeah, I have a feeling that poor Sister Janina was was going to be a mom. And maybe she, who knows? What if she would have said, no, I'm not going to let my child go for it? Who knows? Okay. So many things could have happened to take that where it did. But anyway, interesting, huh? Now, the next story is out of Mysterious Universe. This is titled Some Bizarre Encounters with Gnomes and Gnome-Like Aliens. In the world of the paranormal, there doesn't get much weirder than reports of what seem to be actual real gnomes lurking about, complete with tiny statues, pointed hats, the works, like something straight out of a fairy tale. It seems rather ridiculous that anyone could ever see anything like this, considering they're mostly considered to be the product of mythology. Yet, there are actually numerous and persistent reports of people from all walks of life seeing such creatures, and some of these are often linked to UFOs and alien beings. Here we will look at a range of reports from the bizarre world of sightings of gnomes and miniature aliens. Many of the weird reports of gnome-like beings seem to be firmly linked to aliens and the UFO phenomenon. And one report from the files of paranormal researcher Albert S. Rosales, a witness in Seattle, Washington, in the United States, woke one night in August of 1965 to find her bedroom window open and a small, dull, gray football-shaped object that proceeded to fly into her room through the window. It hovered for some time before deploying three tripod legs and landing on the floor. A small ramp descended, and 5 or 6 man-like figures in tight-fitting metallic outfits emerged, each one measuring only a few inches in height. The figures seemed to be working on something on the ship, after which they went back up the ramp and the craft silently floated back out of the window. Throughout the whole ordeal, the witness claims that she had been paralyzed and that she was only able to move again after the craft was gone. What seems to have been an invasion of sorts carried out by aliens of every diminutive proportions began in the summer of 1970 in the city of Johor Bahru, in the country of Malaysia. On this day, 4 young schoolboys were out in the playground when they spied a silver disc-like object around the size of a dinner plate land and disgorge a group of 5 tiny humanoid beings, which each stood only around 5 inches in height and dressed in some sort of reddish one-piece outfits. As the kids looked on in astonishment, the minuscule little men reportedly crawled down a hole, and the miniature craft they had ridden in just sort of vanished into thin air. When the boys went to investigate, they say they found a small burned patch of grass, but nothing more. The school kids excitedly told their headmaster about the strange encounter, and soon more reports would emerge of similar creatures in the area. On August 19, 1970, A miniature UFO was seen by school kids to land just outside of the playground of the Stowell Primary School in Bukit Mertajam, Pulau Pinang, Malaysia, after which a door opened and a gangplank of sorts extended out of it. There was then seen a procession of little 3-inch tall humanoids with little antennae protruding from their heads and dressed in blue suits, with one of them in bright yellow. These tiny humanoids marched down the plank and mostly ignored the gawking kids as they went about building some sort of antenna-like device until one of the boys tried to catch one of them. At that instant, the one in the yellow suit, possibly their leader, reportedly drew out a weapon of some kind and shot the boy in the hand with a laser beam, after which the kids recoiled away and told their teachers to come see it for themselves. However, the craft was gone when they arrived, and with no sign of what had happened. Later that same day, the little UFO was seen again by one of the school children, and yet again one of the humanoids shot at him, this time causing him to black out. When he was found lying in the bushes, the UFO was gone, but there was a mysterious red welt on his hand where he claimed the mini laser gun had hit him. After these initial reports, many of the children in the area began to report these small UFOs and their enigmatic occupants, with the craft never more than a few feet in diameter and the beings between 3 to 6 inches tall. There were also several other attempts to catch the entities, but they always either managed to escape or shot their attacker with their weapons, sometimes leaving cuts or burn marks upon the skin, including a cut incurred by the son of the local police chief. Reports like this went on throughout the summer of 1970, after which the miniature aliens seemed to have gone away. However, this wasn't meant to last. The year 1973 would see a resurgence in cases of miniaturized UFOs and aliens in Malaysia, largely concentrated around schools. The first of these supposedly happened at a schoolyard in Gambang near Kuantan, where two small boys managed to catch a 3-inch tall humanoid, and on this occasion a teacher would come over and see the little man for himself before it managed to squirm out of captivity and run off. Not long after this, the kids playing football at a playground at Bukit Mertajam saw a silvery craft only 2 feet across land near the field, which was enough for the kids to stop their game and go take a look. It seems to be something the tiny aliens did not appreciate, as they promptly fired on the boys with a bright beam of light to send them scattering before flying away in their craft. Later that same year, another of these little UFOs would be seen at a field in Ipoh, and this time it would be seen by some of the teachers as well as it flew off. There was also a sighting of Miri Sarawak, in which the witnesses, again schoolboys, saw a 6-inch tall little man in a white spacesuit trying to cut a fence with some sort of welding instrument. As soon as the alien knew it was being watched, it ran off and was lost in the brush. Interestingly, there would be many other sightings of these creatures in the white suits by both locals and some people on vacation as well, as a group of the entities was supposedly seen walking along a resort beach in the area of Miri. After this, the sightings would trail off until mini UFOs hit the news again in 1976. In an article for Flying Saucer Review, Volume 26, Number 5, January of 1981, UFO researcher Ahmad Jamaluddin reported that there had been a spectacular sighting of one of the tiny humanoids at the Royal Malaysian Air Force Base just outside the town of Kuantan, Malaysia. The first sighting was made by a 9-year-old witness who saw the creature drinking water from a drain at the base. He said of its appearance, quote, "It had 2 feelers on the head and held a steel-like rod in its hand. A pistol was hanging from its waist. It was brown in color and looked like a man," end quote. The boy said that he went back later that evening with 2 of his friends, and they all managed to see the same being. They then told their teachers about it, and he would oddly say of it, "There was no sign of the creature in the area, but I saw a red Indian-like wigwam, beautifully weaved out of the grass. It was pretty crushed." After this, things would go quiet again until 1979, when once again sightings of these impish aliens would fire up once more. It would seem that the aliens were getting a bit more aggressive than before, as in one report, a boy had his whole arm paralyzed by one of the creature's ray guns, and in another report 3 boys and 2 adults claimed to have been blinded by a beam fired from one of the diminutive UFOs at a place called Kulim. Reports would then stop again, and the last official sighting of the miniature alien invaders allegedly happened in 1985 when a group of 7 6-inch tall humanoids was spotted by some school kids near a stack of wood at a school in Paca, Terengganu, showing that these kids had learned nothing from previous reports of the little entities firing weapons. One of the boys reached out toward one of the creatures and was promptly shot by a beam of light that made his hand very itchy. Albert Rosales mentions a report from Malaysia in June of 1980 of which he writes, quote, "Two young girls aged 12 went to the back of their school to throw some rubbish away. As they did so, they were astonished to see two strange small figures described as very hairy, monkey-like, about 2 inches tall, less than 7 feet away in the grass. One of them was dressed in a white suit with a white hat and white boots, the other wearing all black. They were carrying what looked like a pack and a long weapon on their backs. Their feet did not appear to touch the ground. It was certain that several hours before this incident, presumably the previous afternoon, another schoolgirl was going to the toilet when she encountered a large, hairy, monkey-like creature. Suddenly the creature shrunk in size to just a few inches, at which point the girl fainted. At about 12 noon, the same day, after hearing of what had transpired, some of the students, accompanied by 2 teachers, conducted a search of the area. It is then alleged that 3 entities were seen carrying what appeared to be packs on their backs, and that after being lost from view beyond a large rock, they took off in a small UFO. A U-shaped mark was found on the ground." End quote. After this, the invasion of the little people in Malaysia seems to have subsided, leaving us with many questions. What were these creatures, and where did they come from? Why Malaysia, and why did they always seem to land at schools and appear to mostly children? Why were they so aggressive, and why did these kids keep trying to catch them? Was this all a big ongoing prank, or something more? It is very likely we'll never know or have the true answer to any of these questions, and we are left to wonder. Also from the 1980s is a report from Western Australia, where one December evening in 1984, a farmer was working in his field when he tripped over something on the ground. When he came to his wits, he realized that he had tripped over a small fence-like enclosure, within which there were tiny people in a fleet of miniature buses, going about their business. Oddly, the witness claims that the creatures etched upon his forehead 5 lines like a barcode that remained there for years before they finally faded away. Also from 1984 is a report from Pilar, Buenos Aires, Argentina, where one afternoon in November 3 youngsters were on their way to an open field when they saw little green dwarfs dressed in phosphorescent coveralls and hovering in the air. The terrified children fled the scene. In 1989, 6 gnomes were spotted by some students at the Selayang Baru Primary School in Selangor, once again in Malaysia. The witness said the gnomes stood 6 inches in height, and the creatures were described as bald except for some hair near their ears, and the male entities wore chocolate-colored short-sleeved fur coats with matching shorts. The female gnomes had waist-long hair and wore fur coats and shirts. All of them had pointed ears, Rosales says in his report on the incident, quote, "The students said the gnomes would bite at their hands whenever they tried to catch them. They said that on one occasion when a student grabbed a gnome, the creature swung a tiny axe at the student. The beings would appear in the evening during the school holiday or quiet periods. When the gnomes were discovered, they were playing in the school field and a car park area or having a bath in the drain. One student, Faizul Effendi 9, said the gnomes had sharp teeth and claws, and he was scratched while trying to catch one." Alrighty then. In August of 1991, a witness called El Vasco in Las Pipinas, Buenos Aires, Argentina, was sitting in his living room with his daughter when they had quite a bizarre experience. Albert Rosales reports, quote, "Suddenly his daughter noticed lights, which were approaching the gate located about 100 meters from the house. She tells her father and both observed 2 potent lights that, at first they thought could have been the high beams on a truck. After a few minutes, the lights remained at the location, illuminating the side of the house. Not knowing who or what it was, El Vasco told his daughter that he was going to check who it was. His daughter warns him to be careful and remains in the house. As El Vasco begins approaching the lights, a sudden thick fog appears, completely covering the area, in a 2-meter tall wall of mist. Evasco yells a couple of times, asking who is there, but receives no answer. The fog had by now practically enveloped him when suddenly, at a height of about 1 meter, Evasco saw something dark approaching him. Whatever it had been inside the thick fog and was now slowly approaching. The witness has no fear, only curiosity. At this point, he sees a tiny man emerge from the fog. According to Evasco, the figure was completely human in appearance and proportion, except for its size. It was floating in midair, moving towards the witness. According to Evasco, there was no sound, and there was absolute silence all around. He compared the size of the tiny floating man to that of a bottle of Coca-Cola. It was floating, standing vertically, directly towards Evasco. At one point, Evasco extends his arm and places his palm face up, thinking that the tiny floating man was going to land on it. But the floating figure stopped about 1 or 2 meters away and stared at the witness. Evasco describes the entity as having eyes like two black dots, a very straight nose, and the mouth was barely noticeable. His hair appeared slick and was combed backwards. The body, even though small, was slim. It was wearing a strange, tight-fitting outfit that Evasco couldn't describe. It wasn't cloth. Evasco could clearly tell that it was a male. Evasco didn't notice its hands or if it wore only footgear. He stood in a sort of trance, staring at the strange floating figure. After a few seconds, the floating little man went back inside the fog, and immediately afterward the lights near the fences turned off. Evasco had not heard a thing, and immediately went back to his house. He doesn't remember how much time he had been outside staring at the figure. His daughter had told him that she had yelled at him on a couple of occasions, worried about his safety. However, Baco never heard the screams. His daughter was not able to see the little man. According to Bosco, he had previously seen multicolored lights coming in and out of the nearby river. Always in total silence, he never saw the lights or the little man after this. It is hard to say if all of these incidents were related to aliens or UFOs in any way, but there are plenty of such encounters like this. A hotspot of supposed gnome activity seems to be in Central and South American countries, where they are typically known as the duendes. One such encounter reported on phantoms and monsters comes to us from the Merlo Principality of the city of Buenos Aires in Argentina, where in the summer of 2008 there was a work crew trimming the many trees that lined the Avenida del Inca. In particular, they were tasked with cutting back an enormous 100-year-old eucalyptus tree that had spread its massive branches out so far that it had become a danger to the motorist, speeding by as well as the utility poles gathered about it. The tree was substantially chopped back, and with some reports of it reduced to mere stumps. In the days after the extensive trimming was completed, there were numerous witnesses who came forward to say that they had seen little men with brownish clothes emerging from the stumps in a single file formation, and in most cases headed in the direction of the nearby Leopoldo Lugones library in Piedra Blanca for reasons unknown. Indeed, according to locals, the trees along that particular stretch of road, which travels along the path of a stream, have long been the source of sightings of elvish or gnomish beings lurking about in the branches. Perhaps these creatures called out that those vast tree homes were called that the vast tree home and were now upset that it had been so badly damaged. Another South American report was compiled by the researcher Albert Rosales and allegedly occurred in Casablanca, Valparaiso, Chile in November of 1996, and the account of a group of local students come across a procession of tiny men only around 1 foot in height walking through a clearing. The otherworldly diminutive beings were described as wearing brightly colored clothing of different colors, and they supposedly hid behind the bushes and trees, once aware that they were being observed. While they seemed mostly shy and elusive, one of the entities, who happened to be dressed all in black, purportedly was a bit bolder and more aggressive than the rest, and ran towards the students, shrieking, throwing rocks, and generally trying to chase them off. Oddly, while his black-clad gnome seemed hell-bent on threatening the witnesses, others dressed in green, red, and white seemed to be conversely wave the kids closer. and even called out to them. South America certainly is not the only place from which such bizarre experiences are reported, and there are reports like this from all over the world. On the site of Paranormal About, there is a report from the area of Houston, Texas, from a witness who says one evening in March of 2003, his dog had gone to chase something out in their expansive yard, which he at first assumed was some wild animal or stray cat. When the man went to see what was riling the dog up so much, he claimed that he saw a humanoid creature standing a mere 1 foot tall, with a pointed hat, a white beard, and dressed in a clown suit without the big shoes and nose. The terrified man panicked, retreated into his house along with his dog, and then looked back outside through the window to see the bizarre creature eating from a bird feeder in the yard. It then scurried to the porch, smiled directly at the witness, and then disappeared behind it, never to be seen again. Oh boy. Yeah. Wow. Also, from Texas is a report originally given to World UFO Photos from a gas worker on a gas line near the town of Kennedy, Texas, who one evening saw something odd move about on the periphery of his vision. When he looked to see what it was, it appeared to be a small humanoid standing only a few feet in height and dressed in some sort of strange, impish clothes. In this case, the witness was able to take a photo of the creature and said of his encounter, quote, I was working the night shift on an X-ray crew at a material gas plant. This was around 3 a.m., and there was only 4 of us in the plant at that time. I took this picture after seeing something swaying side to side out of the corner of my eye. I was in the basket of a man lift coming down when I took the picture. By the time I unhooked my harness to get out of the basket, the creature was gone. The police were called and walked premises. The officer told me there were 26 UFO sighting calls throughout that night. If you zoom in, you can see the silhouette of eyes and elongated mouth. I have no doubt of what I believed I saw that night. The other person that saw it with me took off running for the truck. End quote. Is this a hoax or something more? In the state of Idaho, there is an account from a witness on the site ThoughtCo who says his father had this peculiar experience in 1965 while he was out hunting elk with his father and brothers at the Salmon River. At the time, the group had split up to try and cut off a herd that they had accidentally spooked. At some point, he grew tired and took a break by sitting upon a large boulder, and that was there where things would quickly get rather weird indeed. The one who gave the account says of his father's encounter, quote, it was a mildly warm day, and he stopped to rest in the shade of some large boulders to strip off some of his gear and have a drink of water. When he sat down to rest, he felt a rock zip right past his head. Thinking it was one of his brothers playing a trick on him, he yelled at them to stop. That's when he noticed tiny footprints in the soft dust under his feet. And again another rock was thrown in his direction, closer this time. Now my dad had always been told about the little people who lived in the rocks and crevices of mountains and hills, an ancient band of Native Americans who barely escaped from the white man. They made their home in the hills, and if bothered would put a curse on you if you failed to heed their warnings. Following a chill creep up his spine, he slowly rose, gathered his things, and said in very slow Shoshone, I am leaving. I am sorry I disturbed you. As he was walking away down a hill, he heard small feet slapping the rocks behind him, but being a tad afraid, he never looked back. He never told his father or brothers, and could hardly tell me for fear of me thinking he was crazy. I believe him. End quote. What were these things? Were they forest spirits of some sort? Something else? There was another forest encounter of this type posted by a Reddit user who said she and her boyfriend had a strange sighting while out hiking in the Cherokee National Forest in the U.S. state of Tennessee. During their hike, they rounded a bend, and she would say of what they saw, quote, we both stopped in our tracks. There was a tree directly ahead of us, about 20 feet. At the base of the tree, I briefly saw the silhouette of three beings. They were around 3 feet tall and very slender, and all of them seemed to be holding a stick or staff in one hand. One was holding a staff, and with the other hand was pointing at something on the ground next to the tree, and all of them were looking at it. It was as though, when we rounded the bend, we caught a brief glimpse of them, and then they vanished. I did not tell my boyfriend what I had seen, but he went on to describe the exact same thing. So of course we ran over to the tree to see if he would discover what they were so fascinated by. I didn't expect to see anything but dirt and leaves, but it was actually a neat looking rock sitting right there where they had pointed. We love collecting rocks we find while hiking out, but we left this one the hell alone. End quote. Unbelievably, the boyfriend of this witness will purportedly tell a friend from work about what happened, and the man had his own odd tale to tell. She says of this encounter, quote, when this guy was a child, he and his best friend went exploring some local caves. He said it was a point of honor among the local kids to see how deep into the caves they could go, so he and his friend decided to go further than ever before. After plodding along carefully for around 40 minutes, they were startled to see a light up ahead. They crept along toward the light and found that it was coming from this little room-like structure off to one side of the main cave system. When they peeked around the rock wall, they saw that the light was being emitted from a lantern, and sitting around the lantern in a circle were several small men with beards and strange hats, and they were playing with these huge cards with weird symbols on them, unlike anything the kids had seen before. He said these men were incredibly short, and for some reason, he remembered that they had these massive buckles on their shoes, just the classic fairy tale image of a dwarf. As intriguing as the scene was, the kids freaked out and ran off out of the cave. The dwarves never even noticed them. End quote. Besides outdoors, there is a surprisingly large number of people who have encountered apparent gnomes right within the confines of their own homes, pushing it all further past the boundaries of the bizarre. One story comes from the Perm region of Russia in 1989. It was originally published in an issue of UFO Zone. The witness claims that in July of that year, she had been asleep in her modest apartment when she was awoken by a distinct feeling of dread creeping over her. When she opened her eyes, she could see a short figure crouched over her, with a pale gray complexion that looked ancient and large, pitch black eyes like a shark, as well as a sparse beard. Another younger looking one then appeared, and the two gnomes stared at her before vanishing to leave an orb of light in their place, which then drifted out of the room and out of sight. In the United States, we have a story from your ghost stories that supposedly took place in the city of Fontana, California, where the poster lives with his family. One day his brother allegedly had a very eerie experience in 1994 when he awoke in the wee morning hours for no apparent reason. He claimed that he sensed the heavy feeling of eyes upon him, but could not discern where this odd sensation was emanating from at first. This until he looked towards the doorway. The poster says of what happened to his brother next. Quote, he turned to look towards the doorway of the room. His eyes quickly focused on this creature that was no higher than the adjacent electrical outlet. He recalls that the creature was wearing a weird, dirty sport coat. He also records that it had on one of those old boat hats, similar to that of a leprechaun, and most vividly was the sinister, overly exaggerated smile it possessed. My brother's natural reaction was dictated by the intense surge of fear that ran through his body. He quickly sought security under the blankets and turned to face away from this thing. He did not try to rationalize to see if whether or not what he saw was actually physically there. He said it took all his will and might to turn his attention back towards the doorway, and there it was again, motionless, sitting perfectly still and with the same sinister smile. The night carried on, and the sun's rays did make it to his bedroom. Eventually, it was only then that he made an attempt to find this creature. It was nowhere to be found. My brother ended up tucked up under his blanket, unbelievably frightened, until the next morning. Neither of us have any idea as to what it was that he saw. I've heard folklore of gnomes, and the more I think about it, that's kind of what it sounds like. Curiously, for quite some time after this, the house would be plagued by anomalous noises like footsteps when no one else was there, as well as spontaneous clapping noises. Was this gnomes, poltergeist, or what? Who knows? Another account from the same site apparently happened in 1969 in the state of Indiana and was relayed by the witness's daughter. One night, the mother was sleeping with the window open and heard a strange noise outside. As she sat there trying to figure out just what it was she had heard. A bizarre little man, not much higher than a foot in height, came creeping into the room from the window to stand there in the shadow before her. The poster says, quote, "It didn't scare her for some reason, which I thought was strange. It walked up to the foot of her bed, climbed up, and sat down with his legs hanging over the edge. My mom didn't do anything. She said she just stared at him. He looked like a gnome according to her description. At least that's what I came up with. He sat there trying to get comfortable, and when he was finally situated, he reached in a little bag he was carrying and pulled out a pipe. He lit it, took a couple of puffs, turned, and faced her. He said that he had some bad news about my father, but not to worry. He was okay. He continued on that my father was in a terrible trouble and that she would hear more about it in the morning. He tapped his pipe in his hand, jumped off the bed, and crawled out the window. That's when it finally sank in my mom's head of what just happened, and she decided to call out for my grandmother. My grandmother came in and turned the light on and asked her what was wrong. As my mother explained, my grandmother, not paying attention to my mother, noticed smoke lingering in the room and asked if she'd been smoking. My mom told her the story again. My grandmother didn't believe her. The next morning, my mother got a phone call from the army and said that my father was injured in an attack and would come home in about 10 days. My grandparents believed her. My grandmother believed her then. I asked my mom why she thought it was a ghost. She said that was because she could see through him. I thought ghosts could be a floor, could float or whatever. Why did this ghost gnome have to call through an open window? She didn't know. Was this a ghost, a gnome, or figment of the imagination? Next, we have an account from New York City, from right and bustling Manhattan, from a witness who says that when she was young, a girl of about 6 years of age, she would often see small green eyes peering at her from the shadows as she tried to sleep. This went on for some time until one evening it all reached the crescendo of the weird when she witnessed a greenish orb come floating out of the closet and hover there in the room. As she looked on bewildered, the orb began to morph into something altogether outlandish, and the witness would say, "I watched terrified as the orb constructed itself into what looked like two little greenish feet, then greenish pants, and then what looked like a small greenish jacket or vest tops. Finally the head appeared. It had a thick whitish greenish beard and a pointed hat. He looked very vintage and old with beady eyes and wrinkles pulling at his pointed nose. From what I saw it looked angry. It seemed only a gremlin or a gnome thing. It opened its mouth but made no noise. Its eyes were cold and it looked very indulged in my father's shoes. He tried putting his feet in them but kept walking right out of them like his ghostly state couldn't allow him to physically wear my father's shoes. He tried multiple times but couldn't put them on, and he became more and more frustrated. Finally he gave up and threw a kind of small tantrum. From this point I can remember, if he saw me quickly and vanished, that he heard my mother walking back to my room with water and vanished. Since then I have never seen them again." In another account, we come to the state of Virginia, where the aunt and uncle of the witness had a cozy little one-story home that they were about to move out of. As she was helping them clean up the place, the witness went to the spare bedroom to fetch some blankets, and as she moved along the hallway, she noticed that the door to the attic was ajar and the light was turned on. She says of the series of surreal events that followed, quote, "I've been in and out of the house all day and knew that not one person had been into the attic. My mother detests attics, and my aunt won't be caught dead climbing up into one. So I found this all to be a little strange. I continued on my way to the room where I gathered the blankets and then headed back into the hallway. As I was leaving, I looked up into the open air, and there appeared a man. To this day, his appearance has always baffled me, for he was not so much a man, but an elf-like creature. He wore his hair long, and over it was a pointed hat. His clothes were tattered, and I can remember them being green. His skin was brown and his eyes black. He was small. I won't say a midget, for I mean to offend no one, and so for the sake of being politically correct, I will just say that he was no taller than 3 feet. He was not a lean creature and was actually quite round about the middle. He sat hunched over the square opening of the attic, looking down at me with a malicious grin. I froze. "Come here, little girl," said he, to which I did not respond. "Little girl, come up here," he said again. His voice, I remember, was a harsh one, high-pitched, but at the moment, but sometime deep and threatening. Even as a child, I knew that what I was seeing was not human, and it was not good. I stood there in a sort of paralyzed state, staring at this thing in the attic for what seemed an eternity, while he again and again repeated, "Come here, little girl. Come up here with me, little girl." Then, as if my brain was finally able to get through to my feet, I ran. I believe would have run through a wall of linebackers to get out of that house. I could hear him laughing as I took off, a dangerous laugh, one that to this day will raise the hairs on my arms and neck. Immediately, I told my mother and aunt what I had experienced, and they just as immediately wrote me off as having an overactive imagination. After much pleading, I got them into the hallway, where lo and behold, the attic door was open and the light still on. The little man I had described to my mother and aunt had vanished. It was obvious that I was not the one to be done. I was not the one to be done. This being that I was not of the right height to even reach the door, let alone the light inside, which hung another 3 feet above the opening. Needless to say, the packing was left unfinished, and the three of us promptly left the house with a phone call to my aunt's ex informing him he could finish emptying the house himself. Looking at such a range of mind-boggling weird reports as we have been seen here, one is left wondering what to make of it. All these are really quite hard to classify other than that they were some sort of gnome-like little beings, considering that such reports came from all over the place and by such a rich selection of witnesses. It seems worth considering what they may have possibly seen, and this is difficult because the description don't seem to really fit the typical experiences for ghostly phenomenon, and that the idea that fairy tale gnomes could be real seem almost absurd. So what is it? Could these have been aliens or ghosts? Are they some sort of earth elemental spirits, or such impish entities as gnomes, trolls, leprechaun, and goblins have often been depicted in lore? Or are these maybe indicative of some sort of interdimensional phenomenon, with these being bleeding over into our reality through some thin spot in the veil that normally separates us? Whatever the case, maybe encounters with real gnomes and gnome-like aliens truly stretch the imagination, and rank as among the most bizarre paranormal and UFO phenomenon of their time. You don't say. Well, that's pretty weird, isn't it? I'm telling you, very, very unusual story. Okay, I will be back soon with lots more interesting eerie news. Till next time.